Your Honor, I rescued her. $700 a week, every week, for 3 years.
He held my checkbook above his head like a trophy. I sat in that courtroom and watched my son-in-law wave my own financial documents at the judge as if they were medals. The leather cover was scuffed where his thumbs had worried it, worn from his hands, not mine. I hadn't touched that book in 8 months. The court reporter's keys clicked like rain. Your Honor, every week, $700. Every single week for 3 years, he said, voice loud enough for the back row. My mother-in-law was completely dependent on our generosity. The judge didn't flinch, steel gray hair, steel gray eyes. She looked at the checkbook, then at the stack of folders in front of her, as if she'd seen this same performance 100 times. I rescued her from poverty, Your Honor. She had nothing. We gave her a home, an allowance, managed her affairs because, frankly, she couldn't manage them herself. That familiar burn rose in my chest, the one that came whenever he turned my life into a charity story with himself as the hero. I kept my hands folded. I kept my mouth shut, not because I was confused, because I knew something he didn't. The judge tapped a pen once, a small sound in a room built for authority. Mr. Davidson, I appreciate your documentation, she said evenly. Before we go any further, I need to address another matter. She reached to her left and pulled a folder I hadn't seen on the table before, thicker, heavier, clipped closed like it didn't want to be opened. My son-in-law's smile faltered. The judge opened a different folder entirely. But let me start from the beginning, because courtroom victories didn't happen overnight. They built slowly, one small humiliation at a time. 3 years earlier, my daughter Linda brought her husband, Marcus Davidson, to my kitchen table with what they called a solution. I had been struggling since Robert died. Not financially. Robert and I had been careful with our money for 46 years of marriage. But grief made the house feel too big and too quiet. And I made a few mistakes that embarrassed me more than they hurt me. I forgot the electric bill 1 month. I left the stove on twice. Normal grief, my doctor said. Linda heard decline. Mom, we've been talking and we think it's time for some changes. Marcus spread papers across my table like he was running a meeting in a place that still smelled faintly of Robert's coffee. Paper edges rasped against the wood. His tie was perfectly knotted. His smile was perfectly practiced. We want to help. You shouldn't have to worry about bills and budgets and all that complicated financial stuff. Not at your age. I was 71, not 91. It would be better if you moved in with us, Marcus said, glancing at Linda as if she were a witness. We'll take care of everything, your banking, your bills, your expenses, and we'll give you an allowance, $700 every week. That's more than enough for anything you need. $700 sounded generous when he said it like that. Steady, confident, inevitable. It sounded like rescue. What I didn't understand then was that generosity became a cage when someone else held the key. If you've ever had someone help by taking your choices, stay with me. And if any part of this feels familiar, tell me in the comments, because silence is how this kind of control survives. Every Friday became another small defeat. Marcus arrived at exactly 10 in the morning with an envelope. 7 crisp $100 bills, counted in front of me. 1, 2, 3, like I was a child being rewarded for good behavior. There you go, Mom Palmer, your weekly spending money. Don't spend it all in one place. He called me Mom Palmer, never Margaret. As if my first name might suggest we were equals. The envelope came with instructions. My old car was suddenly too dangerous. My credit cards were too confusing. My checkbook was too complicated now, because Marcus was handling the important bills. Don't worry about it, Mom Palmer, he'd say, sliding the envelope toward me. You can just focus on enjoying your retirement. Don't worry about it became his signature response to any question I asked about my own money. Where was my Social Security being deposited? Don't worry about it. Why couldn't I see my bank statements anymore? Don't worry about it. What happened to the savings account Robert and I built for emergencies? Don't worry about it. After a while, hearing it so often made me feel unsteady in my own mind, so I started writing those words down in a small notebook. Not to build a case, not yet. Just to prove to myself I hadn't imagined the pattern. By month 6, I finally admitted what my pride didn't want to say out loud. The $700 wasn't an allowance. It was a ration, cut from my own money and handed back to me with a smile. And the money was only the beginning. The real control came through smaller, quieter methods that were harder to name and harder to fight. I noticed it first in my filing cabinet. I kept our records the way Robert taught me. Labeled folders, years clipped together, nothing loose. One afternoon, I opened the drawer to find a tab I reach for automatically. Gone. The estate folder wasn't there. I stood with the drawer open, the metal rails humming softly, as if the cabinet itself was waiting for me to react. I checked again, then again. I told myself I must have moved it, but I didn't move things like that. My phone started acting differently. Calls that used to ring through didn't. When I mentioned it, Linda said Marcus had added some protection service to keep scammers away. How thoughtful, how protective. Then my friend Dorothy stopped by one afternoon, unannounced the way neighbors did after funerals, after casseroles, after long winters. Marcus happened to be there. He answered the door before I could reach it. Mrs. Palmer is resting right now. You know how tired she gets these days. Maybe call next time before coming over. Dorothy's face tightened with confusion. I wasn't resting. I was sitting in my living room with a book in my lap, perfectly alert, perfectly capable of deciding whether I wanted company. By the time I got to the door, she was already walking back to her car, waving with an apologetic smile, as if she had been the one intruding. Mom Palmer, you need your rest, Marcus said when I looked at him. Dorothy understands. The next week, Dorothy called to check on me. The call went straight to voicemail, even though I was sitting right beside the phone. When I asked Marcus about it, he had an explanation ready, smooth as a receipt sliding from a register. The system automatically screens calls during your rest hours. We set it up to protect your health. I never agreed to rest hours. I didn't need rest hours. I needed my friends. I needed my phone. I needed the right to decide who I spoke to and when. The controls spread like water, finding every crack. My mail started going to Linda and Marcus's house for security reasons. My doctor's appointments got rescheduled to times that worked better with Marcus's schedule because he was my driver now. Weekly grocery trips became monthly trips, with Marcus choosing stores that offered better value for seniors. He had a gift for making every restriction sound like concern. And slowly, my world shrank until that envelope on Fridays felt like the only thing I was allowed to hold without asking permission. I was being managed like a problem that needed solving, not a person who deserved answers. I hadn't spoken to my bank in months. The paperwork arrived on a Thursday. I wasn't expecting certified mail, but there it was, a thick manila envelope with a bright sticker and a barcode. The postal worker held out the handheld scanner. It beeped once, sharp and final, and he waited while I signed the little green slip, like I was accepting something I didn't get to refuse. People didn't send good news by certified mail. Inside were legal documents with my name in bold. In the matter of the guardianship of Margaret Rose Palmer, a case number sat in the upper right corner, letters and digits that looked more like an inventory tag than a life. Beneath my name, typed in the same permanent black ink, was a single word that made my kitchen feel colder than it was. Incompetent. Someone had typed that word next to my name and filed it with the county court. Someone had started legal proceedings to have me declared incapable without mentioning it to me first. And on page 1, under petitioner, the name was printed as if it were a simple fact. Marcus Davidson. The petition was 12 pages of carefully arranged sentences about my declining capacity, my inability to manage finances, my need for supervision. Paragraph after paragraph, my grief became evidence. My worst month became my whole identity. According to the document, I couldn't handle bills. I was confused. I made poor decisions. I needed someone responsible to take over my legal and financial affairs. Some pieces had kernels of truth. I had forgotten the electric bill once after Robert died. I had left the stove on twice in those first months when I moved through the house like a shadow. But Marcus had taken those isolated mistakes and turned them into a permanent diagnosis, typed, stapled, and delivered to my door. On the last page, my eyes caught the phrase that mattered most: guardianship and conservatorship of the person and the estate. Plain English. He wanted authority over where I lived, what medical care I received, how my money was spent, and who had access to me. There was a separate sheet clipped to the front, notice of hearing, with a date, a time, and a courtroom number. 3 weeks away. I read the word again, just to make sure it was real. Incompetent. The word sat in black ink, like it had been waiting for someone to use it. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time. The fluorescent light hummed overhead. The papers made that dry, papery whisper every time I turned a page, like they were talking about me without me. Then I did what I always did when I needed to understand something. I researched. My computer still worked fine, despite Marcus's gentle suggestions that technology was getting complicated. The screen glow filled the room. I pulled up court websites, legal aid pages, anything that explained what guardianship actually meant in real life. What I learned didn't feel like drama. It felt like a door closing. If the court granted his petition, a judge could put another adult in charge of my decisions, my living arrangements, my finances, my medical choices. And once that kind of order was in place, undoing it could be slow and uphill, because the system assumed the protected person wasn't the most reliable narrator. It wasn't just money, it was authorship, it was keys. I stared down at my own house keys on the table, the metal worn smooth where my thumb rested. I imagined them taken, not by force, but by paperwork. I could lose my house keys forever. By the time the sun shifted in the window, my fear had sharpened into something clearer. Marcus wasn't just helping anymore. He was trying to erase my legal existence as an independent adult. That evening when he arrived for his usual Friday-adjacent routine, envelope, smile, instructions, I met him in the kitchen instead of sitting quietly at the table. "We need to talk." He blinked, genuinely surprised. I don't think he was used to me starting conversations. Usually I listened while he counted out my allowance and explained my own life to me. "Of course, Mom Palmer," he said smoothly. "Is everything okay?" I held up the papers. "I received some interesting mail today." His expression shifted, not guilt, more like irritation, like a surprise party he didn't get to control. "Oh, those," he said, as if we were discussing an oil change. "I was going to talk to you this weekend. It's really just a formality, a way to make sure everything is legal and proper with your finances." "A formality," I repeated, feeling the heat rise behind my ribs. "Incompetent" stapled to my name, and he called it a formality. "Marcus, this says you want to be my legal guardian." "Well, yes, but it's not as dramatic as it sounds. Think of it like a safety net. If you get confused, if something happens, everything is already set up. No waiting, no complications." I'm not confused, I said, and I don't need a safety net. He sighed the way people did when they believed they were being patient with a child. Mom Palmer, people with dementia don't always realize they have dementia. And honestly, the bank has been calling about strange activity on your accounts. What strange activity? He gave me a look that was almost pity. You've been asking questions. You've tried to access accounts we moved for security reasons. It's causing confusion. My fingers tightened around the edge of the papers. Those are my accounts, Marcus. My money. I have a right to ask questions. Of course you do, he said, voice calm and practiced. But what feels like a right can be harmful if you're not seeing the full picture. The judge will make sure you have someone objective, looking out for your best interests. My best interests according to whom? According to the law, according to professionals, according to people who can be objective about what's really best for you. He believed himself. That was the part that made him dangerous. He wasn't acting like a thief in a movie. He was acting like a manager correcting a problem. And where would I live once you're my guardian? I asked. He hesitated only long enough to choose nicer words. We've been looking into some excellent facilities, places designed for people in your situation, professional care, activities, other residents your age. On the counter behind him, I noticed a glossy brochure, half hidden under his folder, smiling seniors, a manicured courtyard, a headline about peace of mind. Nursing homes, I said. Assisted living, he corrected quickly. Very nice. You'd love it once you got used to the idea. I looked at him standing in my kitchen, in my house, explaining how he planned to relocate me from my own life, like it was a scheduling issue. Then he smiled again, small, confident, as if gratitude was inevitable. You'll thank us when you're settled somewhere safe. The next morning, I made a decision that would have been impossible 6 months earlier. I was going to get help, professional help, legal help, the kind Marcus had been quietly discouraging me from seeking by making me believe I wouldn't understand it, couldn't afford it, or didn't need to worry about those things anymore. I found the number the old-fashioned way, in the printed phone book Marcus kept insisting was obsolete. Elder Law Associates. The small ad didn't promise miracles. It simply listed what they did, guardianship defense. I called from my landline while Marcus was at work, before his usual morning check-in that had started to feel less like concern and more like inspection. Elder Law Associates, how can we help you? I need help with a guardianship case, I said. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. Someone is trying to have me declared incompetent. There was a brief pause, the kind that told me the person on the other end understood exactly what those words meant. I can schedule you with attorney Sarah Chen. Thursday at 10? Thursday at 10 was the same hour Marcus liked to take me grocery shopping, where he watched what I put in the cart as if my choices were liabilities. Thursday at 10 is perfect, I didn't tell Marcus. For the first time in 3 years, I made a plan that didn't include him, didn't require his permission, and didn't bend around his schedule. It felt like taking my first full breath after weeks underwater. Attorney Chen's office didn't look like the intimidating legal cave I'd imagined. It was bright and tidy. A copy machine hummed softly in the back. When I sat down, the leather chair gave a small creak that made the room feel real, human, not theatrical. She was around 50, hair threaded with gray, eyes direct in a way that made me sit up straighter without thinking. She listened without interrupting while I told her the whole arc. The Friday envelopes, the "don't worry about it," the missing statements, the filtered calls, the guardianship petition, the glossy assisted living brochure I'd seen on my own counter. When I finished, she didn't offer pity. She offered procedure. "Mrs. Palmer, I need honest answers," she said, flipping open a folder. The paper rustled like dry leaves. Has any doctor diagnosed you with dementia or a cognitive impairment? No, my doctor said I was grieving. He said grief can look like forgetfulness. Do you understand what guardianship means in practice? It means Marcus would have legal authority to make decisions about my life, I said. The words still tasted wrong. Where I live, what I sign, who I see. And what are we trying to accomplish by fighting this? I want to remain legally competent to make my own decisions. She made notes. The pen moved quickly, efficiently. Then I mentioned the part that had been eating at me since P1, the part that felt like fog around my life. I haven't seen my bank statements in months. Marcus said he moved accounts for security. My mail goes to his house first, and my estate folder disappeared from my filing cabinet. Her pen slowed. Which accounts do you know he controls? My checking and savings, but I think there are others. My husband was careful. Sometimes Marcus mentions investments and estate planning, and it's like he's talking about a life I can't access. Attorney Chen's pen stopped moving mid-sentence. She looked up, and the shift in her expression was small but unmistakable, like a professional recognizing a pattern. When did your husband pass away? 3 years ago, March 15th. Swipe. And when did Marcus begin managing your finances? About 2 months later, in May. She wrote one more line, then set the pen down as if the next part required a different tool. Here's what we're going to do. I'm going to request complete financial records from every institution where you or your husband have had accounts. Not just what Marcus says exists, everything that exists. Yes, I said. My hands stayed folded in my lap, but inside I felt something lift. Absolutely. Sometimes, she added, voice level, those records reveal surprises. Are you prepared for the possibility that your financial situation is not what you've been told? I thought about 3 years of being treated like a woman living on the edge. About the way Marcus said $700 a week, like it was charity, like it was the limit of what life could offer me. I'm prepared for surprises. By Tuesday afternoon, the paper trail started talking. I was in the garden, trying to rescue rose bushes Marcus had decided were too strenuous for someone your age, when the phone rang. Mrs. Palmer, this is Sarah Chen. I received a set of financial records this morning, and I need to see you again. Tomorrow morning. Can you come in? Something in her tone tightened my chest. Is something wrong? Nothing is wrong, she said carefully. But there are accounts that do not appear in your son-in-law's petition. The next morning, I sat across from her desk and stared at documents I had never seen. Account summaries, quarterly statements, pages of numbers printed in that official, unemotional typeface that made a person's life look like columns. Attorney Chen slid one page toward me and tapped a line with the capped end of her pen. Mrs. Palmer, according to these records, you have a Schwab brokerage account in your name, originally established jointly with your husband, holding approximately $5 million in investments. For a moment, my mind refused to accept the shape of the number. 5 million? I repeated. Yes, the account was opened in 1998. After your husband's death, it transferred into your sole ownership. It has been largely untouched, dividends reinvested, routine activity only. Schwab issued quarterly statements dated through the last 3 years. She turned the page so I could see the dates. March, June, September, December. Those statements were mailed to your address, she said. If you haven't seen them, they were intercepted before they reached you. I thought of the mail for security reasons. I thought of the missing estate folder. I thought of Robert's habit of keeping critical documents in places he didn't announce with fanfare. My husband had been more careful than I knew. Attorney Chen spread the documents in a neat line, like puzzle pieces finally forming a picture with edges. Your son-in-law's petition claims you're financially vulnerable and needs someone to manage limited resources, she said. But you are financially secure. The checking account he controls is a small portion of your total assets. She paused, letting the truth sit in the room where Marcus's narrative couldn't reach. Which means one of two things, she continued. Either he didn't know this account existed, and that raises questions about his competence to manage anything, or he knew, and he concealed it, which raises questions about motive. The copy machine whirred once behind the wall. Somewhere in the building, a stapler clicked. Ordinary sounds, but they landed in me like punctuation. What does this mean for the guardianship case? I asked. Attorney Chen leaned back, not triumphantly, but with the calm of someone who had just found the lever that could move the whole machine. It means we fight, properly. We file our response. We request a full accounting of every transaction Marcus has made in your name. We subpoena bank records where necessary. We document your capacity and show the court you are competent enough to hire counsel and understand what's happening to you. She opened a yellow legal pad and wrote the steps like a checklist, not a fantasy. You've been living inside his story for 3 years, Mrs. Palmer, she said. Now we're going to make the court read the real one. I swallowed, feeling something steadier than anger settle in my chest, determination with a spine. What's our next step? She didn't hesitate. We start with the records, because in cases like this, truth isn't a speech, it's a trail. She looked at me over the top of the file, her voice low and certain. Every transaction tells a story, she said. Within 48 hours, Attorney Chen filed our response to the guardianship petition. I wasn't there when the clerk stamped it, but I could picture the courthouse counter. Fluorescent lights, the dull thud of a date stamp, a stack of papers sliding into a tray, like my life being returned to the record, officially. For 3 years, Marcus had operated under the assumption that I was isolated, confused, and legally helpless. Our filing was the first proof that his assumptions were wrong. Attorney Chen's response wasn't emotional, it was procedural. 16 pages that did one simple thing. It told the court I was present, I was represented, and I was not surrendering my rights quietly. Attached were a capacity evaluation from my physician, my basic financial summaries, and a formal request for discovery, complete accounting, bank records, access logs, anything that showed what Marcus had done for me while controlling what I was allowed to know. She also asked for interim orders, not dramatic punishment, just preservation, no new transfers, no moving accounts for security, no sudden placement decisions. If Marcus wanted to change anything major, he'd have to do it under the court's eyes. The hearing was set for 2 weeks out. The clock didn't stop ticking. It just started ticking where other people could hear it. That Thursday afternoon, I was reading in my living room when the doorbell rang. On my porch stood a woman in a business suit, hair pulled back neatly, an envelope in her hand with my county seal in the corner. She spoke the way professionals did when they delivered bad news often enough to learn how to keep their voice neutral. Mrs. Palmer? Yes. I'm a process server. I have documents for Mr. Marcus Davidson in the matter of Palmer guardianship proceedings. Is he home? He'll be here soon, I said. She didn't linger on sympathy. She simply stepped inside when I invited her in, and we waited at my kitchen table in the clean, quiet space where Marcus had once spread his papers like he owned the air. I could hear the wall clock above the stove, tick, tick, tick. At exactly 4:15, Marcus's car pulled into my driveway. He walked in, carrying the familiar Friday envelope, the one that used to feel like a leash disguised as generosity. He froze when he saw a stranger sitting at my kitchen table. Mr. Marcus Davidson? The woman asked, standing. Yes, he said slowly. His eyes flicked to me, then to the envelope, then back to her. "You've been served," she said, and held out the documents. Summons, discovery requests, and a notice of hearing in the guardianship proceedings for Margaret Rose Palmer. Marcus took the envelope like it was hot. The woman turned, professional to the last step, and walked out through my front door without looking back. Marcus remained standing in my kitchen, holding papers he clearly hadn't expected to touch today. His face didn't show guilt. It showed something closer to offense, like a man who had planned a private transaction and discovered it had become public. "Mom Palmer, what is this?" I looked up from my book, as if this were ordinary. "Legal paperwork." "I can see that," he snapped, then softened his tone like he remembered he preferred to sound reasonable. "But why am I being served? Who hired a lawyer?" For 3 years, Marcus asked questions he already knew the answers to, just to watch me scramble. This was the first time I saw him ask, because he genuinely didn't know. "I did," I said. "I hired a lawyer." His mouth opened slightly, then closed again. "You hired a lawyer? We talked about this. The guardianship is a formality. There's no need for legal complications." "There is when someone files papers to take away another adult's rights," I said. My voice stayed calm. That was the new part. He flipped through the first page quickly, scanning for his advantage, the way some people scanned a receipt for a refund. "This is unnecessary," he muttered. "This creates expense and conflict." I watched him carefully. I didn't mention the Schwab account. I didn't give him the satisfaction of seeing me react to the number. That wasn't fear anymore. That was strategy. Marcus's eyes moved faster across the pages, then stalled at the discovery request. The word accounting has a particular effect on people who've been operating without oversight. "They're requesting bank records," he said, voice sharper. "For what?" "For the truth," I said. He looked up like he wanted to argue, but the papers in his hands had weight now. Official weight. He sat down at my kitchen table without asking, and that was when it hit me, the small, quiet reversal that felt better than any speech. He was the one who looked off balance in my home. The process server found him at my kitchen table. Over the next week, the discovery requests started to produce what Marcus had spent years trying to keep invisible. Attorney Chen took me to my bank branch on a gray morning, the kind of morning where the air felt thin and everything sounded louder than it should. Inside, the number dispenser clicked and spat out a paper slip. People sat in padded chairs with their forms folded like secrets. Somewhere behind the counter, a printer ran steadily, feeding paper through with a soft mechanical sigh. A compliance officer met us in a small glass office, not a manager with cheerful customer service energy, someone trained to notice patterns. He didn't look at me like I was a confused old woman. He looked at me like a client. "Mrs. Palmer," he said, placing a folder on the table, "we received the subpoena and the request for records. We can provide transaction histories, images of checks where available, and account access notes." When he opened the folder, the smell of paper hit me, dry, slightly chemical, like carbon copies from the days when proof came in duplicates. The records weren't dramatic. They were devastating in the way facts often were. 3 years of withdrawals. Every Friday, exactly $700, like a metronome. Deposits that were larger than the story Marcus told me. Social Security, survivor benefits, routine incoming funds that should have made tight budget a lie. And then transfers. Small enough to look responsible, frequent enough to be intentional, money moved into a savings account I had never been shown, as if my life required a hidden pocket. Attorney Chen's finger tracked the lines without shaking. "This is pattern," she said quietly. "Not mistakes." Then she turned to the memo lines. Every transaction had one. Short explanations typed by Marcus, not for me, but for the imaginary audience he expected someday. Allowance for MP. Protected funds for MP. Care costs for MP. And again, as if repeating it could make it true. For Margaret. Those 2 words sat beside my own money like a counterfeit signature, performing generosity with my assets, narrating theft as care. I stared until the letters stopped looking like letters. 3 years of For Margaret memo lines appeared. The records didn't just show what he spent, they showed how he wanted it remembered. By Sunday, family pressure arrived the way it always did, through the front door, wearing politeness. Marcus came to dinner without being invited. Linda came with him, eyes unsettled, as if she'd been asked to play a role she hadn't fully rehearsed. I was setting the table for one, the way I'd done since Robert died. I didn't add extra plates. "Mom," Linda said softly, "Marcus says you hired a lawyer to fight the guardianship." "I hired counsel to represent my interests in a legal proceeding that affects my rights," I said. I kept my tone even, procedural, words that didn't beg permission. "Why didn't you talk to us first?" she asked. I didn't look at Marcus. I looked at my daughter. I tried talking to him. He said it was a formality. He said I would thank you when I was settled somewhere safe. Linda's head turned slightly, the first real crack. "Marcus, you talked to Mom about nursing homes? Assisted living facilities?" he corrected quickly, voice smooth, hands open like he was presenting a reasonable option. I was exploring possibilities in case her condition deteriorates. "My condition is fine," I said. "And this isn't about exploring possibilities." Someone filed papers calling me incompetent. Marcus stepped forward like he could still manage the room with tone. "Mom Palmer, you're escalating this. Lawyers create conflict. Legal fees waste resources. Resources you were comfortable controlling without oversight," I said. Linda's eyes flicked between us, confused now, not by me, but by the gap between what she'd been told and what she was hearing. Marcus tried once more to frame himself as the adult in charge. Just because you can hire a lawyer doesn't mean you should be managing complex matters alone. I saw it then. Even with papers in his hand, even with discovery moving, he still wanted the story to end the same way. With me silent, him decisive, my daughter convinced. I set the last fork down gently. The clink against the plate sounded loud in the quiet. Then I met his eyes and gave him the boundary he couldn't rewrite into a memo line. "I don't discuss legal matters at dinner." The courthouse was smaller than I'd expected. I'd imagined something grand and intimidating, with marble columns that would make ordinary people feel small. Instead, it was a practical building with fluorescent lights and worn carpet that looked more like a government office. Attorney Chen met me in the lobby at 9:30, carrying a briefcase thicker than it had been during our previous meetings. "How are you feeling, Mrs. Palmer? Ready?" "Remember, this isn't a trial, it's a hearing. The judge will review evidence and determine whether guardianship is necessary. You don't need to say much unless she addresses you directly." The courtroom was on the 3rd floor. Room 3B looked like a conference room with wood-paneled walls and chairs facing a judge's bench. Marcus was already there, sitting with his attorney. He wore his best navy suit, the one for important business meetings and family funerals. His posture was confident, optimistic, like someone about to receive a community service award. Linda sat behind him, looking nervous but supportive. Marcus glanced at me when I entered but didn't acknowledge my presence. I suppose it would have been awkward to wave hello to the woman whose legal competency you were trying to strip away. At exactly 10 o'clock, Judge Patricia Morrison entered. Steel gray hair, steel gray eyes, and professional demeanor that suggested she'd heard every variation of family drama and wasn't easily impressed. A microphone near the bench squealed once, then went silent. Someone adjusted it, and the whole room settled. The bailiff said, "All rise," and chairs scraped back in unison. When we sat, the sound of fabric and breath felt loud, like the courtroom had decided to listen to every small thing. "Good morning. We're here for Davidson versus Palmer, case number 2024 GC 1847, a petition for guardianship. Mr. Davidson, please present your case." Marcus's attorney gave an opening statement painting Marcus as a devoted son-in-law who had reluctantly concluded that his mother-in-law needed legal and financial protection. The statement mentioned my grief after losing my husband, occasional confusion about bills, social isolation, and vulnerability to financial exploitation. Then Marcus took the witness stand. "Your Honor, I didn't want this responsibility, but Mrs. Palmer needed someone to step in. She was vulnerable, confused, potentially being targeted by scam artists who prey on elderly people living alone. How did you address this situation?" "We moved her into our home temporarily and took over her finances to ensure her bills were paid and money was protected. I personally handled all banking, gave her a weekly allowance, and made sure she had everything she needed." "Can you describe Mrs. Palmer's current financial situation?" "Her resources are quite limited, Your Honor. She has approximately $50,000 in savings and receives about $1,800 monthly from Social Security and pension benefits. I've been very careful to budget her weekly allowance." "And you believe Mrs. Palmer cannot manage these resources independently?" "Yes, Your Honor. She's repeatedly tried to access accounts we've secured for her protection, asks confused questions about money that's been properly allocated, and recently made concerning decisions like hiring an attorney to fight this protective arrangement. That was when he made his mistake." Marcus reached into his briefcase and pulled out my checkbook, the worn leather checkbook I hadn't been allowed to touch for 8 months. He held it up in front of the judge like evidence in a criminal trial. "Your Honor, this shows exactly what I've been telling you. Every week, $700. Every single week for 3 years. Mrs. Palmer was completely dependent on our generosity." He waved it slightly, the gesture meant to demonstrate his responsible financial management, his careful documentation, his generous care of a helpless family member. He actually wore his best suit to take away my rights. The judge's expression didn't change, but I noticed she glanced at the thick stack of files on her desk, files that Marcus apparently assumed contained only his version of the story. "Mr. Davidson, I appreciate your documentation. However, I need to ask about some additional financial information that's come to my attention." Marcus lowered the checkbook, but was still smiling confidently. "Of course, Your Honor. I have complete records of all Mrs. Palmer's financial transactions. I'm specifically interested in a Schwab brokerage account in Mrs. Palmer's name. Are you familiar with this account?" The courtroom got very quiet. Marcus's confident expression flickered. "I'm sorry, Your Honor. Could you repeat that?" "A Charles Schwab brokerage account containing approximately $5 million in various investments, established in 1998, currently registered to Margaret Rose Palmer as sole owner." Marcus looked at his attorney, then back at the judge as if trying to find the correct answer. "Your Honor, I'm not aware of any such account. Mrs. Palmer's financial resources are documented in the petition. If there were additional assets of that magnitude, they would have been mentioned." "Would they have been mentioned, Mr. Davidson, because quarterly statements for this account have been mailed to Mrs. Palmer's address for 3 years, the same address where you've been managing her mail for security purposes." I watched Marcus's face as he realized the game had different rules than he'd understood. "Your Honor, if such an account exists, this is wonderful news for Mrs. Palmer. It means she's much more financially secure than any of us realized." "Mr. Davidson, You've been managing Mrs. Palmer's financial affairs for 3 years. Have you conducted a comprehensive review of all assets associated with her name or her late husband's name? Yes, Your Honor, absolutely. I've been very thorough. Yet you were unaware of an account containing approximately 100 times more money than the resources you claim to have been managing. Your Honor, I can only manage accounts I'm aware of. If there are additional assets, perhaps they were deliberately concealed during the estate settlement process. By whom, Mr. Davidson? I don't know, Your Honor. I would need to investigate further. Judge Morrison looked at her documents, then at Marcus, then at the checkbook still in his hand. Mr. Davidson, you've testified that Mrs. Palmer is financially vulnerable and unable to manage her resources independently. But evidence suggests she has substantial assets you were unaware of, despite serving as her financial manager for 3 years. How do you reconcile this discrepancy? Your Honor, having resources doesn't necessarily mean someone is competent to manage them independently, especially someone of her age with recent history of confusion. What recent history of confusion, Mr. Davidson? She's been trying to access secured accounts, asking questions about financial arrangements already in place, and recently hired an attorney without consulting her family. The judge looked directly at me. Mrs. Palmer, do you understand where you are and why you're here today? Yes, Your Honor. I'm in a courtroom because someone filed a petition to have me declared legally incompetent so they could become my guardian and conservator. And do you understand what that would mean? Yes, it would mean losing the legal right to make decisions about where I live, how I spend my money, what medical care I receive, and who I can see. Did you hire Attorney Chen to represent you? Yes, Your Honor. And did you understand what you were doing when you hired her? Yes, I understood that I was engaging legal counsel to defend my right to remain legally competent. Judge Morrison made a note, then looked back at Marcus. Mr. Davidson, Mrs. Palmer appears to understand her situation clearly. She's demonstrated capacity to recognize a legal threat and take appropriate action. Can you explain why the court should determine she requires a guardian? Your Honor, managing a $5 million portfolio requires sophisticated financial planning, investment knowledge, protection against fraud. These are complex matters that most people her age aren't equipped to handle independently. Are you equipped to handle them, Mr. Davidson? Yes, Your Honor. I have experience in business and financial management. But you were unaware of the largest asset in Mrs. Palmer's portfolio, despite managing her finances for 3 years. Marcus didn't have an answer for that. Are you aware of the Schwab account, sir? The silence stretched for what felt like a full minute. Marcus sat there holding my checkbook, his mouth slightly open, like someone who had discovered the map he'd been following was written in a language he couldn't read. Your Honor, if there is indeed a Schwab account, I need to understand why I wasn't made aware of it, he said, voice strained now. This represents a significant oversight that should be investigated. Judge Morrison didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She tapped her pen once against the folder, soft, controlled, like a gavel you couldn't argue with. Mr. Davidson, you are here because you petitioned to declare Mrs. Palmer incompetent to manage her affairs. Yet evidence shows she has maintained substantial assets without your involvement or awareness. Just because someone has money doesn't mean they're capable of protecting it from exploitation, Marcus said quickly. Elderly people are vulnerable to scams and manipulation. Are you suggesting Mrs. Palmer has been a victim of financial exploitation? The judge asked. Marcus paused. I'm suggesting that without proper oversight, she could be vulnerable. Judge Morrison flipped a page, Paper whispered in the quiet. But she has not been vulnerable in the past regarding this account, despite your absence, correct? I can't speak to that because I wasn't aware of the account. Yet you managed her other accounts for 3 years, Judge Morrison continued, eyes on the documents, and discovery shows you accumulated approximately $40,000 of her funds in savings accounts she was not given access to. Marcus's attorney began shuffling papers too fast, like noise could create an answer. That money was saved for Mrs. Palmer's benefit, Marcus insisted, without her knowledge or consent. She agreed to let me manage her finances. Did she specifically agree to have portions of her Social Security and survivor benefits placed into accounts she could not access? Marcus swallowed. She agreed to financial management. The details were left to my discretion. Judge Morrison made a small note. Somewhere near the bench, the microphone clicked softly, like a switch being turned. Mr. Davidson, I've reviewed the discovery materials. Over 3 years, you redirected Mrs. Palmer's mail, limited her banking access, and created artificial constraints while moving her funds under memo lines that framed your control as care. Is that accurate? Those measures were implemented for Mrs. Palmer's protection. Whose judgment determined her best interests? Mine, based on my assessment of her capacity and needs. Without input from medical professionals, financial advisors, or legal counsel, I was acting as her family representative. Judge Morrison's gaze lifted for the first time in a way that felt like sunlight on a lie. Family representatives do not have legal authority to override another competent adult's financial autonomy without court approval. What gave you the authority to do what you did? Marcus seized on the one word he thought would save him. Mrs. Palmer gave me power of attorney. Is that power of attorney still in effect? The judge asked. Yes, Your Honor. Judge Morrison turned to Attorney Chen. Counsel, has your client revoked any powers of attorney? Yes, Your Honor, Attorney Chen said. Mrs. Palmer executed a formal revocation of power of attorney last week. Was notice provided to Mr. Davidson? Attorney Chen didn't hesitate. Yes, certified mail and electronic delivery. We have proof of service. She held up a single page. I couldn't read it from where I sat, but I heard the sound it made. Paper held by someone who knew the law, not someone performing it. Judge Morrison turned back to Marcus. Mr. Davidson, are you aware your power of attorney has been revoked? His face tightened. No, Your Honor. You are aware now, Judge Morrison said evenly, and this court is aware that your authority is disputed and has been formally withdrawn. She closed her folder with a quiet, final thump. Based on the evidence presented today, I find that Mrs. Palmer is mentally competent, understands the nature of these proceedings, and is legally entitled to make her own decisions. The petition for guardianship is denied. The words hit the room like a gavel strike. Furthermore, the revocation of power of attorney is acknowledged. Mr. Davidson, you have no legal authority to act on Mrs. Palmer's behalf. Marcus stared at the judge like someone who had just been told gravity had been canceled. Your Honor, I request reconsideration. Mrs. Palmer may seem competent today, but she has made concerning decisions. Judge Morrison raised one hand, not dramatic, just stopping him. Mrs. Palmer hired counsel because you initiated legal action against her. She refused your oversight after discovering financial control without informed consent. Those are protective decisions. She looked down at her notes once more. These actions demonstrate sound judgment consistent with competency, not incompetency. Petition denied. She looked directly at me. Mrs. Palmer, you are free to go. The courtroom wasn't silent anymore. Behind me, paper rustled, chairs scraped, soft murmurs rose as people processed what had just happened. Linda leaned forward with her hand over her mouth, eyes flicking between her husband and me, like she was seeing him, truly seeing him for the first time. Attorney Chen leaned close and whispered, "It's over. You won." I stood slowly, feeling something I hadn't felt in 3 years. The solid weight of legal authority returning to my own life. I walked to Marcus's table and held out my hand. "I'll take my checkbook now." He opened his mouth, searching for a new role to play. "Mrs. Palmer, we should talk about transition arrangements." "Marcus, I don't need transition arrangements. I need my checkbook." He handed it to me. The leather was warm from his grip, worn where his fingers had held it. When I opened it, I saw his handwriting, line after line, the same story repeated. $700, weekly allowance for MP. Dozens of identical entries. Control disguised as generosity. I closed the checkbook and placed it in my purse. "Thank you for your concern, Marcus," I said quietly. "But I won't be needing your management services anymore." Outside, the air felt different. In the courthouse parking lot, I reached into my purse and wrapped my fingers around my car keys. Keys that had been sitting there unused for months, while Marcus insisted on driving me everywhere. I didn't need permission. I didn't need a handler. I drove myself home that afternoon. The first thing I did was change the locks. Not because I was afraid, but because I wanted to hear my own key turning in a lock that only I controlled. The locksmith installed new deadbolts and handed me the keys, metal cool and certain in my palm. "Nobody gets in unless you want them to, ma'am." For 3 years, help had sounded like doors opening only when someone else decided. I wanted the sound of authority to be mine. The second thing I did was call my bank. Not Marcus's number, not the representative line. The bank, my bank. The woman on the phone didn't call me confused. She called me Mrs. Palmer. "We'll issue new checks and new debit cards," she said. "We'll reset access codes. Would you like your statements mailed directly to your home address?" "Yes," I said. "Directly to me." A pause, then the gentle click of keys on her end. "All right, your accounts are now under your sole control." 2 weeks later, Marcus showed up the way he always did. 10 o'clock on Friday, the familiar white envelope in his hand. I opened the door, but I left the screen door latched. "Mom Palmer," he said, lifting the envelope, "I brought your weekly allowance. We're still committed to taking care of you." I looked at the envelope and felt nothing. No gratitude, no shame, just clarity. "That's thoughtful, Marcus," I said. "But I won't be needing an allowance anymore." His smile twitched. "You still need support managing your finances." "I've made other arrangements." "What arrangements?" I didn't explain. I didn't negotiate. I didn't defend myself. "I'm taking care of myself now." For a moment, he stood there, holding the envelope like someone waiting for a bus that wasn't coming. "If you need anything, you can call us," he said finally. "I'll remember that." He turned, walked to his car, and drove away, taking the Friday envelope with him. That was 6 months ago. Linda calls sometimes now. Shorter conversations, politer ones. She asks how I'm doing instead of telling me what I should be doing. The relationship has boundaries now, and the Friday envelopes stopped coming. Today marked 1 year since that hearing. I sat at my kitchen table this morning, the same table where Marcus once spread out papers, and spoke to me like I was a problem to be managed. The light came in through the window the way it always had, but the room felt different now. It felt like mine again. My documents were spread in front of me, not because someone demanded signatures, but because I chose to understand what belonged to me. Bank letters addressed to Margaret Rose Palmer. Statements that arrived directly to my mailbox. Passwords I set myself. A small folder labeled Estate that never left my filing cabinet. The $5 million was still there, quietly growing in accounts only I controlled. But the number wasn't the real victory. The real victory was ordinary. Turning my own key in my own lock, answering my own phone, driving my own car without explaining myself to anyone. It was hearing the word competent in a courtroom and realizing I didn't need to prove it to my family anymore, only to myself. Linda called last week. We talked about the weather, her job, small safe things. She didn't give instructions. She asked questions. That was new. That was something. I'm telling you this because I know how it starts. Small humiliations dressed up as help. If any part of my story felt familiar, share what you've seen or lived through in the comments. And if you know someone who's being controlled behind closed doors, please share this with them. Sometimes the best revenge is simply living well, on your own terms.